Hi, good afternoon everybody, and thank you very much for being here. I'm delighted to see so many of our students from LLL, Ray, Caribbean Women Writers, and of course to Gender Studies, and to all of you who made the effort and who have stayed throughout the day. I am exceptionally pleased to be able to have Alison Donnell here. Alison has a long association and relationship really with the Lit and English department at Cave Hill, and is a very valued colleague and friend of mine, but also of anybody who has done work on Caribbean literature, and particularly Caribbean women's literature. She's a reader at the Department of English at the University of Reading in the UK. And she's published, I threatened to bring all of her books down and kind of have them here to show you, but she said not to. She has published widely on Caribbean and Black British writings, including a book-length revision of literary history, 20th century Caribbean literature, critical moments in Anglophone literary history. And this was published by Routledge in 2006. And she has just, with Michael Buckner, co-edited a major undertaking, a very, very important book for all students of Caribbean literature and culture. It's 700 pages and counting, and it's called The Companion to Caribbean Literature, with 70 entries to be published in May, again by Routledge. She's edited a collection of Una Marson's poetry for People Tree Press, and has a book on Una Marson and Louise Bennett coming out next year. She's the founding and joint editor of Interventions, the International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, and she's on the editorial boards of Macomere and our own Journal of West Indian Literature. And she's currently working towards a monograph entitled Caribbean Queer, from which this paper comes. So I'd like, on your behalf, to welcome Dr. Alison Donnell to speak to us on her topic tonight, Caribbean Queer. Thank you.
I should begin by kind of saying a big thank you to Evelyn, who has always been a tremendous colleague, and with whom I have many fruitful discussions, some of them about intellectual things. Thank you to Richard, Nicola, Andrew, and the participants in today's Criticism and Theory workshop. Thank you to lots of other people like the IRN for a wonderful resource that updates and banks resources relating to sexual freedoms in the Caribbean. And thank you to the students who were really inspiring yesterday when I taught them, and I hope I don't disappoint you. I've put up the slide here of the Breaking Sexual Silences project that Evelyn and I have been running for a little while now. We had our first event here in June last year with Thomas Glave and Unya Kempadu. The idea behind that project really was to try and consider how the arts, particularly literature, with its affective power, could be a way of rethinking and reimagining social cohesion, imagining acts of co-belonging, and more progressive or fluid sites of identity and community, and particularly how that might function in relation to sexual citizenship. What's been important to us is to try and work across a range of audiences, so not just to speak to each other as scholars and academics, but to engage postgraduates. And in the workshop that we had here in November 2008, with postgraduate students in Shani Mutu, and we held a workshop at the University of Reading last year, at the end of last year, where we also had postgraduates from a whole range of institutions coming from Finland and Spain and all over to talk about this topic. So sort of engaging students and a wider public, if that's possible, via newspaper coverage and stuff, has been one of the aims of the project. So I'll just move now from that project page to my PowerPoint. Okay, this is my little idealised beginning, which is ideally life, loves and ideas might then sit freely for a while on the palm of the open hand. For me, the attraction to literary scholarship has always been connected to my belief that reality is susceptible to redescription. In other words, that things can be different to how they are, and that literature is one of the expressive forms that can help us to understand and to even perhaps experience the conditions of different possibilities, of more just and equal realities. As you will all know, the beginnings of Caribbean literary criticism were marked by the momentous challenge to the idea of empire and all of its epistemic legacies, by an insistence on the restoration of value to folk culture, and by an investment in the lives of black subjects as meaningful, significant literary resources. The critical agendas advanced by major thinkers such as Kamau Brathwaite, Elsie Gavaya, Wilson Harris, C.L.R. James, George Lamming, Gordon Rollaire, Sylvia Wynter, they all sought to issue a series of provocations to the established idea of what both literature was and what criticism should do. The challenge for that first generation of literary critics was to make things known, to bring forward and assert the value of Caribbean writing in the context of a decolonising world. In other words, to Caribbeanise criticism. Since the 1980s, subsequent critical generations have mounted feminist challenges to what is known and knowable under the rubric of Caribbean literature, and of course, Evelyn's work has been tremendously important in that regard. There have also been challenges to represent Indian Caribbean subjects, Chinese Caribbean subjects, middle-class Caribbean subjects. But what has been manifestly quiet until very recently has been the challenge to attend to non-heteronormative subjects. My discussion of Caribbean queer identities at a moment of critical is really to kind of situate myself at what I think is this moment of critical contestation now around the issue of sexuality. But I also want to make it clear that my kind of genealogy of Caribbean criticism to date is not just a kind of throat clearing. I see that this development, this moment with regard to sexuality, as being part of that same tradition of Caribbean criticism that began with the generation of C.L.R. James and that understands itself in the context of a politics of freedom and of justice, based on the principles of equality, self-definition, mutual recognition and respect. I know that you're all familiar with the noisy homophobia of the Anglophone Caribbean. We've heard a lot about it today. In terms of the discussion around Caribbean sexuality, that is the familiar territory. And I am kind of aware that obviously in Barbados you've had this slight storm recently about the banning and unbanning of Black Swan. And I noticed that on one of their blogs, somebody had put, censors decide adult Bajans mature enough to see lesbian love scene, and somebody had said, but if the scene had involved two men, what then? So that kind of issues, I think, around the kind of nuances within the so-called hetero-homo divide are quite interesting. But at a global level, obviously it has been the very spectacular and transatlantic noise made by the dancehall affair that spread the sound of Caribbean homophobia. Focused on a relatively small number of dancehall artists, whose homophobic lyrics have attracted attention since the early 1990s. As you all know, the spotlight of that dancehall affair often shines back at Buju Banton's hit Boom Bye Bye, the lyrics of which are fairly unequivocally inciting violence against homosexuals. It was these dancehall lyrics back in the 1990s then that first drew attention and intervention from UK and US gay right pressure groups. Their Stop Murder Music campaign of boycott and media attention was sustained and, some would argue, successful. Over 10 years after it began, in February 2005, there was a verbal agreement not to release or re-release tracks with homophobic lyrics. Yet while that, however we might read it, temporary or strategic truce, may have been staged as a victory for gay rights, a remark made by Glenn Yearwood, who was a reggae industry spokesman, is worth noting, I think. And this is what Yearwood said. We'll advise them that this is not the way forward in a civilised society. I think that that's an important remark because it tellingly signals that there is much playing up to racial stereotypes in the condemnation of dancehall artists, and much Western self-satisfaction in that seeming moment of triumph. And that kind of racialised discourse needs to be unpicked from what seems to be an otherwise liberatory platform of